Hello everyone and welcome to this video. Now this one is going to be a little bit different. I kind of have a presentation here where I'm going to be talking about the effects of porn on the brain. So I'm going to be talking about the different brain changes that occurs due to porn addiction. We're going to talk about some of the symptoms, and then I'm also going to mention a very interesting study that was done on this and kind of discuss the results of it with you guys. So yeah, let's get into it. So to begin with, porn is a supernormal stimulus. Now, what exactly does this mean? So a supernormal stimulus is basically like a super exaggerated version of a stimulus. And basically porn is like an exaggerated stimulus, like sexual stimulus. And what exactly makes porn a supernormal stimulus? Well, it's to do with dopamine. And I'm sure that by now a lot of you know what dopamine is. It's basically a neurotransmitter or a chemical messenger that is made in your brain. And your nervous system uses it to send messages between nerve cells. So as you can see on the photo on the right, it shows you how nerve cells communicate. And basically the cell on the left sends out dopamine and the cell on the right receives the dopamine using dopamine receptors. So think of the reward circuit as the engine that drives our most basic behaviors and dopamine as the gas. So dopamine is really important. It plays a vital role when it comes to motivation and when it comes to seeking reward. And I think I should also mention that dopamine is more about the seeking of pleasure rather than the actual activity itself. So it's more about seeking, craving, desiring. And that's kind of when dopamine gets released, when it anticipates something good. So now we're going to talk about, I want to introduce you to the concept of neuroplasticity. So neuroplasticity refers to the brain's ability to change and adapt as a result of experience. So the adolescent brain is more plastic than an adult brain, and it is primed to wire up to sexual cues. So, like I said, neuroplasticity basically means the brain is able to change depending on basically what you feed it. And when you're younger, that's when your brain really can change the most. That's when it can adapt the most. That's also why you learn things faster when you are younger compared to when you are older. You can create new pathways. This is what happens during porn addiction. You create new pathways in your brain. And you can also weaken the old brain pathways, and you can do this by quitting porn for extended periods of time. And there's also a process called rewiring, where again it's to do with creating new pathways, and it's how nerve cells create connections. So here are 4 ways that addiction and porn addiction changes the brain. So the first one is sensitization, which is hyperreactivity to addiction cues, cravings for it. So it's basically saying, sensitization is basically your brain saying, I want it and I want it now. And then there's also desensitization, which is a numbed pleasure response or tolerance. So this is pretty much when you're building tolerance, when you pretty much need a higher dose or something or a more extreme version of it just to get the same amount of pleasure. So desensitization is basically you getting less pleasure from not just the addiction itself, but also from your daily life in general. So this is a really big one. And then the next one as well is hypofrontality. So what is hypofrontality? It's basically a weakened impulse control or inhibited frontal lobes, which results in reduced willpower. So hypofrontality basically translates to a lower functioning of the frontal lobes. So your frontal lobes or your prefrontal cortex is responsible for many things, including willpower, and we're going to talk more about that later on. And the last change is altered stress response, which is basically minor stress leads to cravings and potential relapse. Masturbating to porn and edging floods the brain with dopamine. So porn itself gives your brain a high dose of dopamine, way higher than normal. However, masturbating to porn and edging causes it to go even higher. And if you don't know what edging is basically masturbating to porn for like hours. Well, not necessarily hours, but like for a long time, without actually getting like an orgasm. So that's actually something really common among porn addicts. And the reason they do this is so that they can they can go through a lot of different videos, different websites, have multiple tabs open at the same time with different videos and like porn stars and that kind of stuff. And edging is really bad for your brain because you are pretty much flooding your brain. You are pretty much putting your brain in an altered state of really high dopamine for extended periods of time. And what do you think happens after you're done? Well, your dopamine just goes immediately back down. And what you end up is you're not going to find as much pleasure in day-to-day life because those other things are not giving you the same amount of dopamine, right? So you're going to end up feeling lethargic or depressed and anxious. And this is pretty much the reason why those negative effects of porn addiction occur, is because you're putting your brain in a way too high altered state of like high dopamine. So here is pretty much a graph to like show that. So as you can see, you have your reward circuit activation. So the addiction brings it really, really high, and then everything else in your life, it just goes really low. And what happens when you go really low with your dopamine? Well, you lose motivation, you become depressed, you don't have much energy, you feel lethargic, and that's something that happens a lot during porn addiction. And I can tell you that this was a very, very big issue for me. I experienced this firsthand, and I can tell you it is horrible. It is just, it's bad. It's really bad. So I mentioned the prefrontal cortex earlier on, so now I just want to kind of explain what it is in more detail. So the prefrontal cortex and the frontal lobes in general, they act as the CEO of the brain. So the function of the frontal lobes are planning, attention, self-control, to foresee consequences, organization, impulse control, modulating mood, and prioritizing. So as you can see here, one of the things is foreseeing consequences and planning. And you might have heard that the prefrontal cortex doesn't stop developing when you're 18, when you become an adult. It actually keeps developing until you're in like your mid-20s. That's what a lot of people say, and that's the case for a lot of people. And that's why a lot of younger people are not really able to foresee the consequences of their actions as well as adults. And that's why their impulse control is not very good. So that's why the prefrontal cortex is a massively important part of your brain. And I mentioned desensitization earlier. I just want to go back to it because it's really important. So overstimulation leads to desensitization. So your nerve cells say enough is enough. So think of this as, to help you understand, it's like when someone is screaming at you really loud. So when someone does that, like what do? A lot of people just cover their ears, right? So nerve cells do this too, but the way they do it is by decreasing dopamine receptors and reducing the amount of dopamine released. So fewer receptors and ends up in weaker signals, which ends up with less excitement. So desensitization can lead to decline in the number of nerve connections in the prefrontal cortex. So this is referred to as the loss of gray matter. Now, this is actually kind of scary because, the reason it's called gray matter is because the nerve connections, the nerves themselves, nerve cells, they're gray. And the loss of gray matter refers to there being less nerve connections. So there was actually a 2014 study found that porn addiction is related to loss of gray matter. Now the thing about this study was that the subjects were not actually porn addicts. So in a way, this kind of shows that you don't even have to be addicted to actually experience negative effects of porn. And if even those subjects, their brain had massive changes. Can you just imagine what the brains of porn addicts are actually going through? So the name of the study was Brain Structure and Functional Connectivity Associated with Pornography Consumption, the brain on porn. And the findings were that more hours per week of porn viewing correlated with a reduction in reward circuitry gray matter. And the lead author of the study said that could mean that regular consumption of pornography more or less wears out your reward system. The same study found hypofrontality was also correlated with porn use. So again, this just shows hypofrontality and desensitization are massive potential consequences of porn addiction. And this study was done a decade at this point, right? So you'd expect by now to be even more research and even more. You'd expect this to be more common, like common knowledge, but like it's really not, because research on porn addiction doesn't move very fast. So that's kind of the state of like the research. So hypofrontality, I mentioned it before, it's to do with decreased functioning of frontal lobes. This leads to lower self-control and willpower. It's like the brain shuts down the ability to override the reward system. So this is why a lot of porn addicts struggle to quit porn, because their willpower has been greatly damaged. And a lot of porn addicts, they just try to use willpower, and it's not really doing anything because their willpower has been impaired. And so there needs to be other strategies in place. So yeah, it's kind of like a really bad cycle that it's hard to like get out of. So in this video, we've talked about how porn is a super normal stimulus, how masturbating to porn floods the brain with an abnormally high level of dopamine, leading to a numbed pleasure response, and how the brain can change and create new pathways. And then I also mentioned 4 key brain changes due to addiction: sensitization, desensitization, hypofrontality, and an altered stress response. So the point of this presentation, I just wanted to introduce you to the concepts of mainly desensitization and hypofrontality, and kind of the effects that porn can have on your brain, and how it can just damage your willpower and just make you depressed and not able to like enjoy other things as much because of your dopamine, and when you're flooding it with dopamine. So that's kind of the point of this short presentation. So yeah, some of this can be pretty scary. I know that a lot of people, when they read this, they just kind of get worried, and it kind of gives them more motivation to quit, and that's understandable. But I don't think that just like trying to scare yourself with the science is just going to necessarily, for a lot of people, lead to long-term change. There needs to be more than that. But like I said, everyone is just has their own experience. So anyway, I hope you kind of got some good new information from this presentation. I hope you learned something. And yeah, if you made it to the end of this video, then in the description of this video there will be a link where you can get a free PDF with 4 tools and resources that I recommend to help you quit porn. These are things that I have personally used. And also I am going to be posting even more content about porn and porn addiction, and trying to help people with that. So if that's something that you're interested in, consider subscribing to this channel. And yeah, thank you, and I'll see you in the next video.